So this is the talk about use the source or join the dark side. And I'm going to talk about the differences between the Docker Community Edition and the Docker Enterprise Edition. And this is the outline for this talk. First, I will introduce myself and explain why there is this talk. Then I will explain about the high-level differences between Docker CE and EE. Then I will explain how it's different to build, ship, and run an application with Docker Community and Enterprise. Talk about the security model, traffic routing, and then give you some ideas if you want to get started. So first, introductions. I'm Jerome Petazzoni. I work for Docker. I'm French, which explains the accent. Unfortunately, ich kann nicht Deutsch sprechen much, so I have to do the talk in English, and I do apologize for that. I joined .cloud in 2010, and maybe nobody heard about .cloud, but .cloud is a company which 3 years later, in 2013, became Docker. So that's great, because I have now almost 7 years of experience on Docker, even though Docker is only 4 years old. So that's a pretty good thing to put on your LinkedIn resume. In 2013, Docker launched, but I also relaunched my career, because before I was an SRE, I was a sysadmin. I was maintaining and building the platform where we were running back then about 100,000 containers. And we decided to shut down that platform and to do only Docker, the open source project. So I was kind of out of a job, and I was kind of wondering what I should do next. And almost by accident, I submitted a talk to a conference in Los Angeles, where I was living back then. That was my first talk about containers. And since then, I've been going from conference to conference and living in hotels and airports, almost. So I used to be a sysadmin and a developer, and now I still develop things and run them, but I also spend a lot of time to share what I learned back then. So first big warning sign, this is a vendor talk. I mean, technically speaking, I work for Docker. I'm going to talk about Docker. I'm going to talk about commercial products. But at the same time, I don't like advertising. I use an ad blocker. I hate advertising, which is probably a bad thing, because technically I'm in the marketing team, so I should like advertising, but I'm a bad marketing person. So I just want to give a kind of heads up that I'm going to talk about commercial products, but my goal is not to sell our products at all costs. My goal is to show you, okay, what do we have in the commercial side? What do we have in the open source side, so that you can make informed decisions? But still, since my background is an engineering background, I'm going to show the things, how they work, and try to be as technical as possible. So why are we having this talk? Well, first, because I was invited to speak, of course. Otherwise, I don't know if I would have had the opportunity. But also, I wanted to dispel a couple of myths. The first one is that a lot of people think that Docker, the company, doesn't have a business model. Well, Docker has a business model. We've had a business model for now more than 3 years. We have commercial products, we have support, we have a license for a bunch of things, we have SaaS offerings, etc., etc. We make a lot of revenue with some customers. I'm really happy that at the last DockerCon, we had one of these customers on stage. That customer is Visa. And before they went on stage, when people were asking me, can you talk about the big customers that are using Docker? I could only say, well, you know the little rectangles of plastic you have in your wallet, and they are somehow related to money. One of them is a big Docker customer, but I could not tell which one. Now we can tell, yeah, Visa is using Docker in production. And this has been going for a while. It's not a new thing. People have been using Docker in production for as far as 2013. So some people can think, well, that's crazy. I mean, in 2013, Docker was completely experimental. What was this about? This reminds me when I started using Linux in, I think, 1996, 7, something like that. And I remember the first internship I got was as a sysadmin in a small web web agency, and they had an empty server, and it was a huge pain because we had to go to the server to physically configure new websites for the customers. And I was like, no, I don't want to go to the server physically each time we have a new customer. That's nonsense. So I proposed, hey, we could use that Linux thing that I've been hacking on my spare time, and that seems really cool. And at first, the CEO said, I don't know, that Linux thing seems really sketchy. It's developed by a bunch of people in their garage. It's open source. I don't know. Turns out that using Linux for that kind of stuff was a pretty good decision. And the first people who used Linux and were kind of scared and didn't know exactly what to do if they had a problem, they ended up buying support. They ended up buying commercial things from people like Red Hat and SUSE. And I think today nobody would tell that Red Hat or SUSE don't have a business model. So I think for Docker is the same thing. Like Docker is pretty new, so a lot of people are like, can I put that stuff in production? The answer is yes, you can if you know what you're doing, and if you're not too sure, you can get help not only for Docker Inc., but from all the people who kind of jumped in the container train, so to speak. All right, but what I want to do today is to kind of show you what exists in the open source side, what exists in the commercial side, so you can know if you are excited about one side, the other, both, or neither. So there will be lots of demos because I don't want to do a marketing talk. I want to be a little bit technical, so I want to do demos. I want to show that it's a real thing. And also, Docker has a big tradition of demos. Usually, we do offerings to the demo gods. If you've looked like the keynotes of DockerCon, we always find some kind of thing. But in Berlin, I didn't know what would be appropriate, so there will be no offering to the demo gods. So if the demo fail, we will know why. So the demo application that I will use is the demo application that I showed yesterday during the Docker workshop. It's the Docker Coins application. It's an application that is available online. So if you want, you can reproduce those demos on your own machines to see that, yeah, it's real code. And it's built around a microservices architecture to be as close as possible from the kind of thing that people would deploy with Docker. So this demo can run anywhere, and that's going to be my first show thing. I'm going to go to a website called Play with Docker, and Play with Docker is something great when you have something really quick to test with Docker, but you don't have Docker on your machine, you can't connect to your remote clusters or whatever, so you just go to playwithdocker.com, you say, I want a new instance, and there you have a new instance. And so this is a Docker sandbox. And in that Docker sandbox, which is like brand new, clean, nothing installed, I'm going to get the code for my demo, and I'm going to run it. All right. And if I do typos, it's harder. All right, so when I run this application, we can see that it's going to download some Python stuff, then it's going to build a Python application. After that, it's going to download the Redis image. So we have Python in this application, we have Redis. Now it's pulling Ruby, because we also have some Ruby stuff. In this application, since it's a tutorial, I wanted to have a little bit of everything. I didn't want to have a pure Java application and then have people say, no, I don't do Java, so I don't want to touch that. Or only Python, and then the people who only know Python feel, no, I don't want to touch that. So in this application, we have Python, we have Ruby, there is a web UI in Node.js, and the database that I use is Redis because I wanted to have something as simple and as possible, so that when people start to look at it, they don't get confused about the implementation details. They can just focus on the containers things. So this application is it's building native extensions in Ruby, which always takes a little bit of time. But when I timed it earlier, in 1 minute and 30 seconds, I had the app up and running. So hopefully that will work just as well. There we go. Now we have more Python and then some Node. And Play with Docker is a great environment. The only downside is that big ominous countdown in the top left of the screen. It means that this sandbox environment will be destroyed in 4 hours. In 4 hours, we will be done, don't worry. But this means that it's a good environment for practice and training, not so much for production, obviously. All right, so now my application is running, and I see the little badges here telling me that my application is exposing ports. And if I click there, that's the performance graph of my application, and this confirms that my app is up and running. So that's the basic, like running an application on Docker on my local machine. In that case, it's not the local machine, it's some sandbox, but same thing. So what are the high-level differences between Docker Community Edition and Enterprise Edition? So first, the most obvious difference is that the Community Edition is free, while the Enterprise Edition costs money and is based on a subscription model, a little bit like RHEL, for instance. It doesn't mean that you buy it once and then you have it forever. It's more like a subscription, and as long as you have the subscription, you can get the latest versions, etc., etc. The Community Edition is made for developers, which means that, for instance, when you are using Docker on a Mac or Windows machine, you end up having the Community Edition. And it's also good for small organizations, and you will understand why when we look at the feature matrix, kind of. The Enterprise Edition is optimized for business-critical production apps, which means as soon as you have some money on the table and you want to be sure that things will work right, and you want to be able to slap fingers on somebody when something goes wrong, then you want the Enterprise Edition, basically. Because if something goes wrong, you can call Docker Inc. and say, hey, what the hell is going on that machine? Both versions have a release cycle of 3 months, so every 3 months there is a new stable release. But in the Community Edition, you also get every month what we call an edge release. Edge is always better than bleeding edge, because bleeding edge it's always a bit more scary. But we call it edge, and so that's the great version if you always want to have the new features before they land in the quarterly release. And the Enterprise Edition also has a ton of additional enterprise features. So at first, if you had asked me what about those enterprise features, the only one I could have told you would be, well, I think there is LDAP directory integration. It turns out that there is really LDAP directory integration, and it turns out that there are also lots of other features that I will show you shortly. This is a graph to explain kind of the release schedule, but it's here mostly for future reference. I will show you a link with the slides just at the end of the talk, by the way. Another difference is the supported platforms. The Community Edition, as I said, is the one that runs on Docker Mac, on Docker Windows. You have Docker packages on most Linux distros. The Enterprise Edition, there is some overlap between the platforms, but you have also some platforms that will be only in the Enterprise Edition. For instance, RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE, Oracle Linux, and there are editions as well for most cloud platforms, so Amazon, Azure. There is a Google one in the making. And one of the key things in the Enterprise Edition is that there is a certification program so that you can say, okay, this is a certified platform like AWS or this specific hardware vendor. Like we have partnerships with people like HP to provide machines that are kind of like Docker ready. And when you get a certified stack, so you have the hardware or the cloud is certified, the Docker is certified, the plugins are certified, etc., then you get rid of the finger pointing. The finger pointing problem is when you have something weird on your storage array and the storage vendor says, oh, it's because of the operating system. The operating system says, oh, it's because of this incompatibility with whatever, etc. No, here the point of certification is to say all that stuff works fine together and we won't do finger pointing. If you call the wrong person, like you call the storage vendor and the problem is on something else, instead of telling you, oh, the problem is somewhere else, leave me alone, they will have, like by contract, they will have to go themselves to the other person and figure it out, which is great for enterprise users. Okay. Enough like marketing slides. How do I deploy an application on a cluster? when I'm using the Community Edition and the Enterprise Edition. The Docker motto is build, ship, and run any app anywhere. And here I'm going to explain exactly what build, ship, and run means. Build, that means we take the source code and the Docker files and we make container images. Ship, that means that using a Docker registry, we are going to take those images and spread them to the whole cluster. And run, well, that means that we are going to run containers from these images. So the demo is that I'm going to log into a cluster that I prepared just before. And on this cluster, so that's a Swarm cluster with 5 nodes. And I'm going to use the open source tools to do that build, ship, and run operation. So I go to my Docker Coins demo app, it's the same application, and I'm going to do Docker compose, Docker coins build. So for those of you who have done the workshop yesterday, you've seen that yesterday. And here, by the way, I cheated a little bit. I've built the app first time before the talk because I didn't want to wait 2 more minutes during the build operation. Because I can talk for 2 minutes while things happen, but maybe not too long anyway. Then I'm going to ship, so I'm going to push my application images to a registry. And there again, I cheated a little bit. I did the push just before the talk because I didn't want to wait 2 more minutes while we're pushing the application. But this highlights that Docker has a caching mechanism. When you don't change your code too much, or even when you don't change it at all, if you rebuild and repush, it's extremely fast because it does a kind of diff between what you've built before and what you're building now, a little bit like a makefile. And same thing when you push an image, it's able to know which layers, which parts are already in the image repository and which things need to be updated. And finally, the run part is Docker stack deploy, Docker coins, -c Docker coins YAML. All right? And after this thing, normally my application is up and running. Okay? So I would like to see exactly, is it really running? Because that seems really quick. So I want some proof that my application is running. I want to list the services that have been deployed. I want to see the status. I want to see the logs of my containers. And I would like to enter in a container to do some like basic debugging things. So with the Community Edition, we have a CLI and an API. So with the CLI, I can do something like Docker service ls. I see all the services on my cluster. Then I can do something like, hey, I would like to see that this web UI thing. So I can do Docker inspect. Well, maybe it's better, yeah, like that. Docker coins, web UI. And in that output, somewhere, it's command line. So it's user-friendly, but it's very picky about its friends. And here I have, there is a published port 8000. So, okay, I know the CLI, so I know how this works. So I know that this means that my application is running on port 8000. So I'm going to point my browser to the IP address of my machine, port 8000, and I get the same graph as before. Almost the same graph, because if we look on the left-hand side here, we see that the speed is like up to 30-something instead of, sorry, that's not super readable, but here it's 5. Because when I'm running on the cluster, I have some extra deployment parameters when I say, instead of putting one instance of each service, I want you to have multiple instances of the services just so that the application is faster, because I have a cluster and I should take advantage of that. Okay. Then I can see running containers, and if I want to do some debugging things, I could enter a container, always like command line, so docker exec tr e3 esh, and then I'm in a container, so I see that, yeah, there is a Python worker running in that container, and here I could do some additional like debugging commands in the container, as if I had gotten an SSH connection to that container. So that's all nice and fancy, but if you're not a huge fan of the command line, or if you're just getting started, it's a lot of information to learn about. So I want to show what we have on the enterprise side. We have something called UCP, which stands for Universal Control Plane, and it's basically a web UI for all that stuff. So I'm going to connect to UCP, and since I deployed this. Yeah, there we go. I wanted to log in. Yeah, so I have this nice login page. Hello, that's me. Right. And then here I can see I have a bunch of things I can click on. I see my nodes, my services. Here I can see my stacks and applications. I have my Docker Coins app here. If I click on it, I see all the services that are exactly the same services that I was seeing before. And likewise, I can click on my web UI to see the same information as I was seeing before. Like if I click around a little bit, where is this like port number information? Yeah, it's here. A published port, etc., etc. I mean, it's just a web UI, and it's not the only one that exists out there. For instance, there is another web UI called Portainer, which is pretty awesome. But the advantage of a web UI, it's not to substitute for a CLI, because if you want to script things, if you want to automate, you will want a CLI generally, because automating things with a website, yeah, of course you could use Selenium or something like that, but it's probably not a good idea. But when you are getting started, or if your main job is not to run containers, like I would say you're just a developer, and at some point you have to go and see, is the thing really running? Can I see my logs? Instead of having to find in the CLI, how is it supposed to be working? How do I connect, etc. You can have a web interface, and the advantage of a web interface is that it's a little bit easier to find about things. For instance, here, I want to see the logs for something, like I want to see the logs of RNG. All right, so I click around, and here, logs. And I get the logs of that service. If I want a shell, I have a console button here. And here I get the same console that I had before, but this time it's in my web browser. And I would like to disclose the fact that as of last week, I had never used that web interface. I have seen demos about it because, I mean, that's our commercial product, so I'm supposed to know about them, but I had never installed UCP. I had never used it directly. So after just a few days of like mousing around, you can be comfortable using that kind of interface. Okay. So same thing with UCP. So now, yeah, that's what I did. What if I want to do some changes to my application, like I want to scale up and down? So I'm going to do that as well. I'm going to make changes to my running app. So I'm going to do like a Docker service update, Docker coins walker, -- replicas 5. I currently have 10 replicas for that for that specific service. I'm going to show that. Yeah, you can see it here. Here we have Docker coins walker, 10 replicas. Good. I'm going to use the command line to bring that down to 5 only. And I get no more feedback than that. So did it work? Well, let's see. Like I'm going to look at the web interface, and after about 10 seconds, I will see that the graph is going down here. So yep, my change did work. The graph is kind of divided by 2, and if I go to the control plane, I might have to reload here. Yep, now I see that I only have 5 walkers. Okay, I can do the same change in the web interface, and I mean, it kind of depends on your perspective. Some people think that it's easier because you don't have to look around and learn the specific command. Some people, once you know the command line, some people will think that it's harder because you don't know where you have to click in all these options. But the whole point is to have both options, depending on whether you want a web UI or a command line. Of course, there is way more than a web UI. So now that I scaled back up my application, if I go back here, yep, my graph went up. Great, so I made some basic changes to my deployed application. All right. Now, what if I want something like metrics? So that's where we start to have some differences. If you are using the open source version, the community edition, usually if you ask about metrics, the answer will be, yeah, you could use something like Prometheus or Snap, and you have to deploy it like this, like that. So basically, you have to do it yourself. In the enterprise edition, we have at least some basic, I think we call that spark lines, maybe. That means some kind of live information about resource usage. So it will take a few seconds to load, and then I can see the evolution over time of the CPU usage, memory usage, network activity, and I can as well have something for my whole cluster. If I want to get an idea of should I buy new machines yet or not. So I see here CPU usage between 7 and 15%, memory usage, etc., etc. So that gets some kind of basic things so that in just a glance I can know how my cluster is doing. You can do that with the community open source edition, but you will have to add a few layers. Okay. Now security. So first, the things that I'm going to mention here are true both for the community and enterprise edition. The clustering model that is used in Docker uses the SwarmKit library, and the SwarmKit library puts a strong emphasis on security. There is automatic creation of a certificate authority. Each node has its own certificate and key that are signed by this certificate authority. Those certificates are rotated automatically. The communication between all nodes is encrypted using a per session key that is renewed regularly. Like all the, if we were looking at some kind of a guide of how to build secure systems and have a big matrix with all the requirements, I think SwarmKit would have all of them or almost all of them, because that was really a huge thing that we wanted to solve. There is also one thing, the least privilege architecture principle, which is the same principle as for secret services, which means that if you don't need to know something, then you don't know it. So in a cluster, that means that if you define a password or some credentials somewhere for one specific application, only the nodes that are running this application will have access to that data. The nodes that are not running this application don't have access to the data, meaning that if somebody manages to hack into a node, they can't escalate to the whole cluster. There is this kind of strong isolation. There is even on-disk encryption, which means that if somebody steals your servers or your backups or manages to like steal some backup disk or whatever, they cannot get access to the data because it's all encrypted. There is the notion of secrets, and again, that is both in the community and enterprise editions. Secrets are arbitrary blobs of data. It could be a private key, it could be a password, it could be anything, and it will be kept only on the manager nodes, it will be kept securely, and it will be handed off only to the services who need them. So I'm going to show how secrets work, just because it's going to be a good introduction for the next section. So I'm going to create a secret using the command line, docker secret create. So that's going to be, let's call it DevOps con, and the secret password will be Berlin, and then a rainbow, and then a whale. Okay, now I'm going to add that secret to an existing service in my stack. So I'm going to do Docker service update. Let's give this secret to the Redis service, secret add DevOpsCon. Okay. And once I've done that, I'm going to go to my universal control plane. I'm going to find this Redis service. and I'm going to get the shell in the Redis service. This is my console, okay. And now, if I go to, let me zoom that a little bit. If I go to this /run/secrets directory, I see that a new DevOps.conf file has appeared. And if I look in it, I get the secret that I just added before. And yes, you can put emojis in password and secrets because this is 2017. So this is an example of one of these files that will be only in that container. So I don't know on which node that service is running. Maybe it's running on the second node, let's say. If somebody manages to hack into the third node and they want to access that secret, they can't. Well, if they hack the second node and they completely root it, then they will have access because technically the secret is on this node. But that way, what I can do is split my clusters between different zones. Like, okay, this is where we have most of our business applications. This is where we have payment processing things, so higher level of security. We are going to run only the payment processing things on those nodes and never any other kind of thing. This is where we have like the blogs and other various demos and experiments of the marketing team. And the marketing people often are not extremely strong on the security side. I know because I'm one of them. So we have a specific side of the cluster just so that they don't pollute the rest of the cluster with their experiments with no security, etc., etc. Okay. So secrets, I said that this is a good introduction for the next thing. It's like, the thing with the Docker API is that when you have API access, then you can do anything. Like if I go to my UCP here, if I go to my secrets tab, I have like my DevOps.conf secret here. And of course, like somebody created a secret, but anybody that has access to UCP could use that secret for anything. So that's not good. So that's where we have the notion of authentication and authorization. Within the Enterprise Edition, I can create users, groups, permissions, and there is a fairly advanced permission model. I'm going to do a demo, but keep it like really simple. I'm going to create a user, like a normal user, as opposed to my admin user that I have right now. So I go to user management, I create a user, Jerome, and I put a password, and I'm gonna give me like a restricted control. Okay, I've created a user, so now I'm going to log with that user in a different window. All right. And now that I'm logged in, if I go to the Resources tab here, in the Application section, I see nothing because there is this strict separation. Instead of seeing all the resources, like the admin user, I only see my own resources. And in particular, if I go to the Secrets tab, I don't see the other secrets, and I can't use them. So now I can have like production and developers on the same cluster and give them different access levels, and so that the developers can still deploy like staging, test, QA, etc., but they cannot access the production stack, not always by malice, but often by mistake. If you look at the big catastrophes, like the horror stories, like, oh, we lost all the customers' production data, it's rarely because somebody wanted to mess everything up. It's just because they made a mistake. That's it. I saw recently on Reddit somebody who said, oh, I think I'm in big trouble because it was my first day and I just went through the runbook to deploy something, and at some point I used the credentials that were in the documentation, and I didn't realize that those were the production credentials. And so when I initialized the database, I ended up dropping all the data for all our production website. Am I in trouble? So at first we could say, yeah, you messed up big time, you destroyed all the data. But in fact, if you look better, who made a mistake? The person who in their first day did not realize that this documentation wiki had the credentials for the production, or the person who thought that it would be a good idea to put the production credentials in the documentation wiki that the new hires will use on their first day. I will let you judge on that, but I don't think that person is really in trouble because honestly, of course we must be careful and etc. But on your first day, if you're given the full powers to destroy the production database, maybe something is wrong in the onboarding process, especially if you can like use them without realizing it. Anyway. Okay, so now with my Jerome user, I want to create like my own Docker coin stack, Jerome coins, and no, that's a secret tab. Sorry, stacks and applications, deploy, Jerome coins, and here I'm going to paste the stack file that I have here and create. Access denied because I probably forgot something. Maybe I did not give myself enough privilege when I created the user. All right. It's maybe I need full control here. Yeah, as I told you, I just got started with that whole thing. So deploy. Still access denied. Let's see. I'm going to show that the other way around. I'm going to create it from the main admin and show how to delegate it to a user. So I'm going to create a new stack. And then once this stack is created, I'm going to inspect it. And here I should be able to change. Whoa. Yes, that might be why. Save. So I say, okay, I want this stack to be in the dev group, and then I'm going to put Jerome in the dev group. So I create a team. Let's say that's the dev people. I'm putting Jerome in the dev team. And I think I have to say, yep. All right, and now if I did things correctly, I will have, where is my Jerome control panel? Yes. If I go back here, yep, now I have the stack shows up and this specific service shows up. So I can delegate access on services and on stacks. I just need to remember how I can allow this user to create their own environment instead of just delegating. But as I told you, I should have rehearsed this demo a little bit more. I do apologize. But you get the idea. You can have different permission levels for creating an application, viewing an application, or changing an application. So that way you can really have the level you need. Sometimes you want people to be able to create their own applications. Sometimes you just want them to be able to view what's going on. And sometimes you want them to be able to deploy, update, and change an application. But you don't want them to create new apps because you would end up with tons of apps all over the place, and you don't want that. So under the hood, this is using authorization plugins. And what's really interesting here is that this whole like user and group and permission model, I showed it in the Enterprise Edition, but it's using a plugin system that is common to both editions. In both editions, each time you do an API request, because you're creating a service or you're doing anything, your API request is going to be examined by the authorization plugins. And each authorization plugins can say OK or not OK. So if you have no authorization plugins, then it means all the API commands are enabled. But if you have authorization plugins, then those plugins can control what's allowed and what's not allowed and what's visible, what's not visible. And the Enterprise Edition web interface is just a plugin like that. So it's not using any custom like secret options in the engine. It's not like using backdoors or undocumented API endpoints, which means that people can build their own web interface with exactly the same kind of permission models. You can even chain those plugins together. So if you want, you can combine this authorization model with some extra custom authorization models. Like I want to require 2FA each time there is a command on a specific stack. Like each time somebody deploys the production stack, I will require a code generated by 2FA, for instance. Now, other features that are different between the CE and EE are the way traffic is routed. Both editions have a TCP routing mesh where you can expose ports, and you can have load balancing, and you can have load balancing not only inside the cluster, but also for traffic coming from outside. But on the Enterprise Edition, there is also an HTTP routing mesh, which means that if you want to have multiple web apps in the cluster, as you probably know, you can only have one application sitting on port 80. So if you have multiple web apps, you need to decide who is on port 80 and who has to be on another port. So the HTTP routing mesh is just a reverse proxy that will take care of routing all the incoming traffic on port 80 and route it to the proper applications. So in the Community Edition, you basically end up building your own with Nginx or Apache or HAProxy, and you have tons of recipes out there to do that. But in the Enterprise Edition, there is something to do that automatically and dynamically. And normally, here, if I deploy it correctly, if I go to my resources in Jerome Coins, I should have, for instance, if I look at my Web UI service, I can see here that in my published ports, my Web UI has been published to a hostname route. And if I go to that hostname route, webui.devopscon.dckr.info, then I get this. If I go to another route like rng.devopscon.dckr.info, then I get the RNG service, which is not exciting because it's just telling me, yep, I'm running. And if I put a name that does not exist, like not existent.devopscon.dckr.info, I don't know what's going to happen, but let's find out. Yeah, it's going to tell me service not available. And this is implemented using labels on my services. So when I want to expose a service on using that routing mesh, all I have to do is add a label like this one to say com docker UCP mesh HTTP. So that label is a little bit like a message that I leave for the routing mesh to say, hey, this service here should be exposed on that host name. And then the routing mesh will look at those labels and it will configure automatically the HTTP proxy sitting on front of the cluster. This we can also handle like TLS termination and a few other features, but that's the general idea. There are other things that are different between CE and EE, and here it's just like a bunch of extra features that the Enterprise Edition has. For instance, when you want to host container images with the Community Edition, the simplest option is to use the open source registry. That's what I used for these demos here. But when you have the Enterprise Edition, you have something called DTR, which is the Trusted Registry, and it's a registry for container images, but the big selling point is that it's integrated with all the users and groups and permissions that are in UCP. So when you create a user in UCP, then that user can also have access to specific images, etc., etc. You also have tons of third-party options. So again, I don't want to give you the impression that if you want users and groups, etc., your only choice is the Enterprise Edition. I just want to show what's in the Enterprise Edition, but for almost every feature that I'm showing here, you also have third-party implementations, sometimes open source, sometimes free, sometimes for money, sometimes specific to a specific cloud provider, etc., etc. There is one big scary security question, not specific to containers. Like, oh, I just downloaded this program from the internet. It's supposed to generate cat pictures. Is it safe to run it? The answer is it depends. It's like we could make sure that you download it for a trusted source? Like, did you get that from something sketchy.downloads.ru, or did you get that from something like Microsoft.com? You could check that it hasn't been compromised in transit. Like, did I really download that from the right place? And you can also just like run an antivirus, and it's not like the universal answer, but it's a pretty good defense mechanism. With containers, we have pretty much the same question. Oh, I just found this really interesting image on the Docker Hub or wherever. Can I run it safely? Well, you can first check, where did you get that from? Is that an official image from MySQL, Nginx, Oracle, something like that? Or did you get that from some completely unknown person / weird image? You can check that it wasn't compromised in transit, and you can run it through a security scanner. The security scanners are the equivalent of the antivirus in the container world. So how do I know that I got stuff from trusted, reputable sources? Well, there is the Docker store, there is official images, there is a mechanism called Docker Content Trust, where you can sign an image, and then you can say, on this cluster, I only want to run images that have been signed. It's a pretty strict thing, but it's pretty safe as well. There is integrity checking, and that's in all versions of Docker. Like when you pull an image, it's going to get a manifest that says, this is the checksum, the digest hash for all the layers of that image. So it's really hard to compromise an image in transit, or if somebody can do it, then it probably means that they broke SHA 256, and then we have other problems. And finally, there are security scanners, so both like from Docker, but also from third parties. And if you're really a paranoid person, you probably want to run both just to be on the safe side. How to get started with all those things? So there is the little demo I made in the beginning with Play with Docker. And I would like to show, like, I think it's one of my favorite things to do almost. Where did I put my Docker playground? Yeah, it's here. So currently, it's a sandbox with just one Docker node. I'm going to show you how I can test clustering features with that Play with Docker thing. I'm going to click on Add New Instance here. So now I have 2 nodes, 3 nodes. I could go up to 5, but this is good enough. Now I'm going to create, let's see, I'm going to create a cluster. That's it. Oh, wait, I forgot a flag. And there we go. I just created a cluster. That was hard. Now I'm going to add nodes to my cluster by copy-pasting this command on the other nodes. And I think I need to pay attention to the line breaks. Okay. Yeah, this was harder than I thought because the copy-paste is hard. Okay, and then I'm going to add another node. And now I have a 3-node cluster. That's all you need to do to experiment with a Docker cluster. And if you are better than me and copy-pasting, it will take you less than 1 minute. Otherwise, it will take you 2 minutes. But that's just because I have some problems copy-pasting, apparently. So that's how you can get started and experiment, even if you don't want to set up a bunch of VMs on your laptop with VirtualBox, or if you don't want to set up a bunch of VMs on EC2, you just want to kind of do some quick experiments. You can use that Play with Docker thing and play with the open source side really easily. Last things. Okay. Yep, demo. There are more things, so more little details, like the demos that I showed here were running only Docker on a specific environment, like on EC2 VMs and using Linux applications, but you can run Docker on physical or virtual machines. You can run that on the ARM architecture now, which is good for embedded devices like this, or some energy-efficient hosting providers now offer ARM hosting options. You can run Windows applications, and you can manage mixed clusters with Windows apps and Linux apps, and you control everything from the same API or from the same like web interface that I showed you. And there is even a program for legacy applications, like monolithic applications. And at first, when I heard about that thing, I was like, what is this about? Because the idea is that you can take your old monolithic application and put that in a container. So my first reaction is that, well, this is weird. Why would anybody would do that? And then I had to remember, maybe 10 years ago, I was in the process of trying to put up to date like an old Windows NT machine, and we were kind of freaking out because it was some weird hardware. We knew that if we had any hardware problem, it would be the end of it. So we wanted to virtualize that Windows NT machine. And I had no idea how to do that in a really safe and easy way. And a friend told me, well, just try that program. I can't even remember the name, but it had P2V in it. And I was like, what is it? Well, you run the program on your Windows NT machine, and it's going to give you a VMDK file, so a file for a virtual machine. And then you can just run that on your VMware cluster or whatever. And I'm like, how can that possibly work? How can I turn a physical machine in a virtual machine just by running a little program? He told me, well, just try it. And I didn't really trust that program, but I tried it anyway, and it worked great, and it was a kind of aha moment, because for me, virtualizing machines was I'm logging into the server, and I look what's installed, I installed a new server, and then I install the same packages, and I copy the configuration files, etc., etc. So it's a lot of manual work. Turns out that you can automate that really well. You can kind of transform a physical machine into a virtual machine, and so now we have similar things to transform a server, physical or virtual, into a container. Maybe it won't be the nicest, cleanest container ever. It won't be the same thing as if you take a container expert and you ask that person to make the nicest Docker file and everything, but it will be a container, and it's an excellent starting point when you want to move stuff into containers. All right. Conclusions, well, we saw how to build, ship, and run stuff, not only with the Community Edition, but also with the Enterprise Edition. I hope that this gives you an idea of why there is that Enterprise Edition. All those features like access, user management, the routing mesh, etc. All those features are things that hackers, not in the evil person sense, but as in tinkerer, those people can do that themselves very easily. Oh yeah, I just need to write a 10 lines Nginx config file. I can do that. I just need to deploy Prometheus. I can do that, etc., etc. But the Enterprise Edition is there so that the people who want to kind of go straight to deploying applications and rely on a big ecosystem can do that with trust. Okay, that's it. I think we have maybe a few minutes for questions, and this is a QR code for the slides. Normally, I didn't test it, so I hope it works. Thank you. Questions? Does the QR code work? Yes.
So usually you have groups and so on for permissions. Usually you have groups for permissions and so on. Can it be integrated with LDAP, with the Windows security groups?
I think I heard LDAP, but I'm not sure. Right, yeah, there is LDAP integration. I saw it in the options. I don't know exactly how it works, but I know that there is something so that at least your users can be defined in LDAP. I have no idea about the permission model, but yeah. To be completely transparent and honest with you, I mostly evangelize our open source products. So I'm often, thanks. I'm often really late on when we do an enterprise side, but I'm also trying to be aware of what we do because let's be honest, the money is on the enterprise side. If we didn't have those enterprise products, in maybe a few years we would run off investor money and we would have to shut down operations. So we have to do that dirty things where we have salespeople and marketing and etc. So I'm not super aware of all the features of the products, but again, to be completely honest, 1 week, 10 days ago, I installed UCP and I started to click around to see what we could do with it. Since I didn't have an LDAP installation, I didn't try to connect it to LDAP, but I saw there was an option to do it. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
I have also a question related to UCP. I don't want to put you on the spot here. The stuff you showed with creating users, delegating permissions, etc. Can I somehow script this? Can I do this?
Right, the question is, all that user management thing, can it be scripted? Yes, that was one thing that I was very happy about when I was looking in documentation. Each time there is something about, how do I create a user? You have like a bunch of documentation where, I mean, I'm a command line person, so when I see that kind of documentation, I feel like they think I'm stupid, they explain on which button I need to click, etc. But then at the bottom of the page, it says, if you want to do that from the CLI, this is how to make the curl request to the API so that you can automate that stuff. And that's when I understood that we really got some good persons working on that because I was like, wonderful. Absolutely, UCP has its own REST API, you can use it, and the docs explain how to do that because I mean, often you have an API, but just to figure out how to use it can be a little bit annoying. So in that case, I saw little examples to like you can copy-paste the example, put your credentials, you get a token, and then you can do API requests, and yeah. Yeah.
The enterprise metrics, how much is that related to the stuff you would get if you run Prometheus?
Yeah, the question is about like the metrics that we see in the enterprise edition. Is it related to the work done with Prometheus? So on the version that I'm running here, that's 1703. So I think it's just transient ephemeral Sparkline. But on 1706, which we are in release candidate now, there are like the metrics endpoint that are exposed, and I don't know exactly if the Enterprise Edition will have like a Prometheus engine built in, but it will make that much easier if someone wants to do that, yeah. But I think it gets the information the same way, except it's aggregated just as a kind of short-lived thing and not persisted, I think. But I'm not sure. But okay, then the last thing I will say, you have the question as well, or? Oh, like. So the question would be kind of, can I also have permissions on networks so that I can say, oh, I don't want somebody to create a service connected to that network? That's a good question. I know it's on the table. I don't know if it's implemented in 1703 or 1706, but it's, I mean, all objects can have labels. Now I don't have on the top of my head which objects can have permission labels yet, but I know that it's part of the things we want to do. One thing that is coming in 1706, for instance, is new network plugins to do like Mac VLAN and host networking in Swarm mode. That's something that people had been asking for a while. It's kind of linked to that. Yeah, the last thing I wanted to mention on the metric side, I wanted to give a shout out to the Prometheus project because it's been, I mean, working with Prometheus shows that it has been done by people who had the same challenges about like transient metrics and elastic workloads that the challenges that people have today with containers. So if you're looking for something to do metrics on container workloads, whether we're talking about low-level host system metrics or business metrics, definitely check out Prometheus. And that's the thing that we used yesterday in the workshop. Yeah. And I'm not saying that just because there is a Prometheus person here, but if you have more questions, you can also ask him. Thank you.